Hello, everyone. I'm going to get us kicked off here in the next session. For those who don't know me, I'm Megan Harbold with Skai. I'm the VP of PMM and Communications for our team here. And I'm super excited to talk to you about data. As you heard in the first session, right, it's very much always top of mind. I do want to just start by lowering some expectation. This is a trick. I know we're all kind of getting back into the world. We're all trying to figure out how to be people again, how to talk, how to learn, do some small talk. We've had a ton of great opportunities this week to meet with our internal teams over the last few days. And you know, there's always those icebreakers of like, what's a fun fact? Well, the fact that I used a lot this week was huge board game geek. And I kid you not, in my house I have probably over 500 board games. It's a little bit of a problem. Very competitive person. Long story short, the winning strategy is ultimately move one, move two, assume you're gonna lose. Assume something's gonna go wrong. Assume everything is going to fail and you're not gonna actually win. And then when you do win, you look awesome. So I'm a very nervous presenter. I'm probably gonna overskip. I'm gonna say some weird things. My voice is gonna crack. So just putting that out there so that when I don't do that, it'll be great. So data is power, right? You heard a lot of great things from Rick and team over there in the first session. Ultimately, it is the foundation. You can't do your jobs well without having data. The question is, how much data, what data? How much is too much data? How do you actually filter through that noise? So we have some really great conversations about that coming up. But I want to start with a little anecdote to kind of visualize that for you, right? When you look at this picture, it seems pretty clear cut, right? Very obviously, my friend Laura is being proposed to. It looks very nice, well thought out. Clearly, he's got the nice little "Marry Me" sign in the background, had a photographer there. Ultimately, looks like she's both surprised and happy. You could make a really obvious assumption that you should also be happy for Laura, right? She's going to accept they're going to live happily ever after. Well, what if you were to zoom out a little and actually see that up on the hill, her dad followed them to this nice remote location and said, don't do it. When you actually have that full data set, you see that whole landscape, you understand the whole picture, you're starting to doubt maybe some of your earlier assumptions, right? This now calls into question everything that I thought I knew about their relationship, her dad being a good guy, and or, you know, should I congratulate her now? Is she gonna change her mind? What's gonna happen? It changes how you define success by seeing that whole picture. There's one more layer that we need to look at, and that's her reaction, right? This fun little Photoshop picture of my friend Laura ultimately helps us put into context not only what I assumed, what that assumption is in the broader picture, but now because I know her reaction, I have confidence to say, she said yes, they're engaged, they're gonna be great. As advertisers, we definitely make sense of the things that we can see. So a big part of the problem is making sure that we're seeing the right stuff. Enter data, right? We'll talk a little bit here next about the types of data and ultimately how we sift through that data. And then we have some great panelists that I'll introduce in a minute to have a deeper discussion on that. But ultimately, think about this as we go through some of these next data points and types of data. So in this last survey that you've been seeing a lot of the results around, there it goes. One of the questions that we asked was, again, what type of data are you actually using to inform your overall strategies? And I think this is a really important sentence, right? You're using it to inform your action. It's easy to do when you have that one picture, when you see just the initial proposal. A lot harder to do when you add that contextual layer of what that proposal is doing in the broader sense of things. What data helps you see that bigger picture? And then more importantly, what data helps you zoom in and assume and get clarity around that context? A lot of us as retail media marketers are focused on product level, search, keyword level data. That's one area that a lot of us have started to figure out. but it's very siloed. It's very specific to a specific retailer. How do you connect the dots across all those different channels and media platforms that you're using? Additionally, how do you weave in that competitive intelligence? How do you weave in the information about your audience? This is where we feel every single one of these numbers, right, should be closer to 100%. The type of data is, that we see here is all of it's relevant to inform your action. Very overwhelming problem to solve. Not anything that any of us have a silver bullet for at this stage. We want to kind of simplify it a little bit, and we'll kind of use this model and talk through this in some of the panel questions, but if we actually just first define data versus intelligence, really important thing to put some context down. Data is ultimately the facts that you're collecting. It's what you're analyzing. They are the inputs to intelligence, right? The intelligence is the ability to acquire that data, but then most importantly, apply it to become knowledge. Without that application, it's worthless. Data on its own becomes noise. Data that is segmented or fragmented, noise. Data that is not accessible across the different functions in your organization, noise. So what types of data are really needed? Again, we're trying to kind of simplify this into, we like to call it a hierarchy of needs, a hierarchy of data needs. Ultimately, to really know commerce, and again, this isn't just know retail media, this is know commerce. This is the broader picture. You heard a lot of that in that first session, where it's not just, what your bid is in a certain silo that is impacting the overall success. It's the entire journey, it's the entire functional support that enables that sale. And so what is the data that you need? First and foremost, performance data. Again, this is where a lot of us have been focused over the last several years. This is me, this is my brand, this is what I'm doing, this is in the walled gardens how I'm doing. I have clarity around how that campaign is performing, and I'm able to very clearly understand what to do next in that frame. This is the proposal picture, right? I have very clear line of sight to what's happening in that bubble. If you add in the next layer, you've got retail analytics. This is going to be much more of that competitive intelligence. This is me versus others, me in the category. How am I doing versus what that size of the opportunity actually is? This is getting a little bit harder to solve for, but again, things like share of voice and market share, these are numbers that more and more of you guys are really applying as your true north metrics. We think there's another layer, and this is that context, right? What are the consumer insights? How is your actual audience reacting back to what you assume is happening in that broader whole and or what you know is happening within your specific campaigns? When you have all of this together, you can now take the reaction, right? You know to go ahead and celebrate their engagement. You know to go ahead and throw your friend Laura a party. If you did not have that context, if you did not understand that maybe she was feeling like she needed to back away and you threw her a firework party, could be a little bad, could be a little awkward. At the least, when you have these types of faux pas, it's opportunity cost, right? But the worst, you could really do some damage to your relationships with your customer, to your overall brand, and it's not good. There's some really interesting case studies out there today about big splashes in the market with things that they had no line of sight to at all to the consumer's reaction, and it became very detrimental. Excuse me. So I want to end, again, kind of taking even more a step back. All of this conversation around the data and having that hierarchy of needs met, it's still only step one. You have the commerce intelligence when you have that data, that's cool. Now you have to actually apply it to action and actually make the activity intelligent. This is a huge gap, again, a huge challenge to not only have that full picture, but know exactly what it means to do next. And this is what we want to talk a bit more about today. So without further ado, I'm going to bring up Sam and Morgan. And I'm going to move some stuff around. Hello, guys. Thank you. Welcome to this fun little stage where it's really warm. Just a little note. Please give everybody like 1-2 second overview of you, your role, the context you have when it comes to data.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Sam Bukowski. I lead global commerce strategy for Group M. So look after all of our operating companies across our regions in the world. And really my job is to every day help brands develop not just what their commerce strategy is across the ecosystem for today, but what that looks like for them in the next 2, 3, 5 years in this crazy world that we're living in. So nice to see some familiar faces.
Morgan Shimmy. So I oversee acquisition and retention marketing for the direct channels on HP, so effectively HP.com. And then I work with our global UX teams to ensure a clean, seamless shopping environment. I'm probably less versed than Samantha over here with the data side of the house, and the programmatic team gave me very specific notes that I'm supposed to stick to. So if you guys see this come out, that's why. So I mean, as it comes to data and data privacy, I mean, for me, it's just all about as a brand, the level of information that we have, specifically as a technology brand, when it comes to our capabilities of targeting people based upon their interaction with our devices, is one side of the house, and how we effectively leverage that. And the other side of the house is just because of our size, because of how many people use our technology, we just really need to be very careful and cautious about how we're using different types of data to target end customers, and it's getting increasingly challenging. So excited to be up here discussing it with you guys.
Awesome, thank you. Cool, so let's get started. I think softball question that you've already started to kind of answer, but maybe to elaborate on a little bit more. How are you getting access to the data you need to do your day-to-day? What is the primary mechanism, the way by which you're actually getting that data into your job?
Yeah, you want me to start? So I think one of my favorite things about working in commerce in general is that it's kind of like the great unifier, right? Like we're forced to interact with all these different data sets every single day. And so what we really focus on is sitting at the intersection of all of the relevant stakeholders. And I love that this was touched on in the first session about before you start to look at your performance data, do you actually have recognition of like SKU level profitability and certain signals like that? So we work very cross-functionally to make sure that we don't only have those media performance inputs taken into whether that's a custom visualization solution or a cloud solution, but we also have all of the retail signals from all of our partners and then all of the business signals from our clients, right? So down to that SKU level profitability. So we're very much liaising not just with marketers, but with sales teams, with trade teams to make sure that when we do these analyses, that it's a well-rounded approach to how we're tackling data and analytics. And so our number one thing is to make sure that we're avoiding fragmentation, that we're centralizing all of that, and then we're democratizing out to our teams to use it in the most powerful way that they can.
Yeah, that fragmentation piece is really interesting, and I know, Morgan, you have some thoughts on like how you guys are approaching using data in like a very segmented way, right? Because that is what's accessible to you today. It is fragmented, and so you're using it to support the channel very intentionally, very specifically, versus tying those together yet at this point. Comments, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I alluded to, one of the key benefits that we have, as well as a lot of other smart just device manufacturers, is the amount of data that we ingest back from the devices themselves. And can't get too specific, don't want to get my hand slapped, but if you think about, everybody in this room has owned a laptop or a cell phone, and at some point you notice, for example, it just doesn't hold the charge as well as it used to. And so we can actually see those types of signals from devices. So we can go ahead and see, hey, this laptop's 3 years old. Instead of the battery holding a charge for 8 hours as it was initially designed, it's only holding a charge for an hour and a half. And we know that that's the kind of trigger that a lot of customers will go ahead and they'll start shopping around for a new PC. And so being able to take that data, put it into a clean room so that another partner, the name partners, can actually pull that data down and effectively target these end customers and effectively close the loop with us with the conversion data. We're able to kind of see from end to end how we use the device data to inform partner targeting and whether or not it actually yielded a conversion. And obviously a lot of this is overly ambiguous, but we're able to go ahead and do things like that I think we're in a really great position that I wish all brands could be in. Maybe not our competitors, but all other brands could be in, because I think having that level of information and being able to target customers when the time's right versus all the time, obviously it protects our media spend and eliminates waste, but also I think I think we're increasingly bombarded by messages, and I think they're less relevant potentially than they used to be, as much as everybody's trying. And so I think our ability as marketers to go ahead and use the right data to ensure that the messaging is on point at the right point in the customer journey is critical.
Yeah, I mean, it's an older story, right? Right message, right time, right person, all those. And we had for a minute, right, the data needed to start to do that within specific walls, right? And now, obviously, deprecation of cookies, like a couple major shifts, both regulation-wise, consumer trust-wise, that adds a whole nother layer of complexity to this puzzle. You guys have solved a lot of that first-party data need through your actual devices. You've built it into your product innovation. Sam, any ideas or any things that have come about from your clients on how they're trying to solve this bigger and bigger gap on first-party data?
Yeah, it's been a challenge, and I think, if nothing else, though, what it's done is it's forced a lot of innovation in the industry, and I think it was like a worthy time for us to have our feet held to the fire to do this a little bit differently. And I think what that looks like is different depending on the category that you're operating in, and we'll have clients more along the lines of an HP, but then you go and you have a discussion with a consumer packaged goods company where first-party data was not really a core focus of theirs for years, and should it be moving forward, and should they start thinking about direct-to-consumer experiences in a new way? And so it's forced all of these new conversations, and what we have seen is a lot of exploration, a lot of provocative thinking in the way some legacy business models have been discussed before. And so new ways to get that first-party data has been huge, and then what we're focused on is leveraging all the right solutions to, at the end of the day, to your point, just continue to make advertising work well for consumers, right? We don't want to lose that relevancy. We don't want to let the deprecation of cookies hinder the consumer experience, right? There's a reason why these things are successful when the consumer sentiment is positive. And you'll hear our North American CEO, Kirk, talk about this a lot. But at the end of the day, it's always just about making advertising work better for people. I think there's plenty of solutions out there to do that, even with the privacy constraints that are in play today. And we're finding creative ways to do that. So a little bit of out-of-the-box thinking, but it's pushing the whole industry forward.
I think I think just in general, things are getting increasingly complicated as a whole. I think it was just like a couple weeks ago that there was some law that came down in Austria that restricted a lot of the information that Google was sharing, because the idea that European customer information was being transacted to people in the US and people running GA. People effectively were able to pull GA details from customers in Europe, became like this whole to-do. And so effectively, like I think it was literally last week, Google effectively removed IP addresses from GA for audiences in Europe, and like that, something like that is kind of the new normal. Like every week, every month, there's these new regulations that are coming out, and so I think it's really kind of hard to future-proof when it comes to some of these elements. And so, as a brand, we're working a lot more closely with the likes of whether it's the Amazon, Google, Facebook, where it's informed consent. The customers know exactly what information they're giving up. I think obviously with what's happening in Ukraine, around the world right now, like news in particular, right, is like just highly desirable. And so if you think about like somebody like the New York Times, like no paywall, you go ahead and you can register with your Google account, and when you give them access that you're getting this news, but in exchange for this news, you're giving up some details, right? You're giving up some personal details, you're allowing for a greater degree of targeting as a result of that. And I think a lot of customers are okay with that. And I think for us, we're really kind of steering more towards those types of partners where the consent is implied, and there's that whole middle layer that kind of operates in this gray area, and we're slowly starting to kind of move away from those data partners, and we think that that's going to be kind of, I think it's what customers expect, and I think it's what customers deserve, and so moving much more in that direction.
I think that's a huge takeaway, right? Like as you look to participate in this land grab for data, making sure you keep, again, line of sight to that consumer, that experience, doing it in a way that's very informed. I love your point about, again, how HP only really partners with those who you know have established that trust and transparency as well. Like you're even proliferating that into your actual vendors and the people who help you actually execute so that you know that you can trust it. I think that's a really, again, crucial takeaway. D2C is becoming more and more important for many brands. Similarly, you're seeing retail try and participate with their own media networks, things like that. Again, getting that first party data through brand activity. It's a very interesting time for sure. It adds to that level of fragmentation that was part of the earlier discussion. That's a big challenge for not just brands, but all of those of us who are marketers. How have you seen organizations that you work with, in your case, Sam, pull this together? Are they building things like center of excellences around data? Is it becoming its own function that connects those dots, connects those functions in those organizations? Or are you still seeing a lot of that segmentation happening?
It's a little bit of both, honestly. And I think that's a really critical place where agencies can be helpful too, right? Like I spent most of my career on the brand side. But having come over to the agency now and finding the places where we can really jump in to make a difference. In some of the more mature businesses, we're seeing really fortified data and analytics teams that are connected to every piece of the organization who day in and day out are just focused on making this work. Right? The data architecture of these brands and taking them to the next level. That's not the case for everyone, right? Not everyone has the ability right now to stand up these huge teams. And so where agencies can come in is we can bring our engineers and our data scientists to the table, and that's when the magic happens, right? When we can all put our heads together. That mentality coupled with our ability to approach the retailers on behalf of some of the world's most powerful brands and also challenge them, some of whom are here and have been excellent partners, to say, let's find new ways to do this, right? There's a reason why retail clean room solutions are evolving and becoming more sophisticated, and direct data transfers and API access is opening up, and there is a really positive shift happening to more collaboration. And I think whether that's something you're focusing on doing in-house or looking for external help, either one's really fine. It's probably a matter of where you are in the maturity spectrum to some degree. But I think it's all really positive signals.
I mean, I think for us, we started in-housing a lot of our data back in 2015. And so it's readily accessible for internal parties, and then for select external agency partners, and it's everything you would expect. It's it's ad server information, it's log files, it's DSP data, and then we effectively consolidated it under Datarama to make it a little bit easier to find. I think the big problem is there's so much data out there right now that educating your team on what the right data is, and even your partners knowing what the right data is challenging. They use a metaphor internally. It's you have to take the behind the wheel class before you can drive the car. And I feel like a lot of times people want to jump right into it. They want to jump right to driving the car before they kind of learn the basics, ins and outs. And I think that's challenging, but I think we're doing our best to to offset that internally. And I do feel like the approach that we've taken, where we brought a lot of this in-house, is increasingly common. It's no different than a lot of big brands have. No disrespect, but a lot of big brands have reduced their reliance on agencies and started to build their own in-house agencies.
We're saving that for later.
Oh. All right.
We can have you participate in the debate
different
later.
Panels.
No, I mean, it's a great point. I think, again, accessibility is key. Again, major takeaway there. But I do think line of sight to what data is important, that intentionality of setting up that function of who is not only getting the data, but analyzing that data and the types of insights that you need to do your job, that's an intentionality that this kind of concept of a land grab for data has put at stake. People are thinking, oh, I need to get benchmarks across my top 50 competitors in order to know really what's happening. I mean, do you though? Like, what is it that you are going to use that data for? And again, do you need to potentially breach some trust with your consumers, like, for you to really do better? Like, or can you, I think it came up earlier too, right? Like, a lot of this data already exists. Maybe you're just not using it intentionally enough today because you're not asking the right end question, like what it is you actually want to do with it. And I think a lot of the success of being that intention is having data be very close to activation. That's obviously our perspective at Skai and why we're in business. But how, especially on the agency side, Sam, when you have a new client, how are you bringing them into the fold of understanding what data you need for you and your team to execute well? And how do you kind of convince them to share maybe some of that first-party data that would otherwise be kept under lock and key?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think there really is a ton of trust between us and our clients. And the reality is, with the scale at which we operate, and no one is going to be more above board with your information than we are, because we have no choice. And I don't think you ever have to sacrifice trust with the consumer to be successful in this space. I really don't. There's ways that we can do this that are creative and interesting and collaborative, where everyone's data remains very, very safe. The point that I think is interesting about the noise is we've arguably have now more data signals than we've ever had, right? But we're also operating in more walled gardens than we ever had. And I think it's important for the data to live very closely to activation so that we know what levers to pull to drive the business forward. But I would even argue that it's also a much further upstream conversation that we like to have first with our clients, because what I'll see happen sometimes is we'll get into this analysis paralysis mode of having all this information to look at, and we're all very curious people, and we'll find 100 things that are really interesting. But when it gets down to brass tacks of like, is this successful or not? That's based on whether or not you had a clear business objective up front.
Correct.
Right? And it's like, we have to kind of take a step back and set those objectives very early so that when we're pouring through all this information at the end, we can all very clearly look at each other and say, that drove our business objective forward. Mm-hmm. All the rest is interesting, right? But maybe not as important to the things that we set up front. So for us, it's really about that end-to-end business planning. That way, when we are, looking through all of this stuff at the end, where we know which data points are going to be more important to delivering our business objective than potentially others. So that's a very, very important conversation. That helps give our activation teams some clarity and some guardrails as they're optimizing every day. If they know what you're optimizing towards as a business, they're going to do a better job, and it all kind of comes full circle.
And I would add to that, it's not just having goals, it's having realistic and correct alignment of goals, right? So I think, again, there's a lot of conversation about up-leveling, or I guess adding advertising to that customer journey, right? Much more awareness, much more kind of establishing the need even before a consumer knows it, right? By being there and being a part of that upper funnel. That's not going to be reflected in, a 1 to 10 ROI, no matter what you do. And I think, again, from an agency perspective, from an internal selling and performance reporting perspective, making sure there's clarity in those expectations is critical. How do you do that today? Like, are you finding yourself doing a lot of that kind of internal selling or expectation setting? Any tips and tricks for those of us who still have to do that?
I mean, a little bit. I think something that you said is interesting about like the upper funnel and the measurement is we live in this world of performance where more often than not, we want to optimize towards a conversion and a sale, and that's considered the ultimate measure of success, and that's great. Everything we do is in service of, selling your product or service. But there's also a time element to this, right? When you're operating further up the funnel and you're building brand equity, and that's where the longevity of your brand is going to stand, we're going to measure that differently and on a much different timetable than all of the really great short wins we're getting in that lower funnel performance media. You can't lose sight of the entirety of that spectrum because it's a slow burn, but it happens when you start to ignore some of those maybe longer term pieces further up. It might take you a year or two to realize what that equity degradation is doing further down the funnel, but it does happen, right? So we very much stress when we approach data and measurement that we're not losing track of the different time horizons that we're talking about, so that we don't get too tunnel vision on what's happening in the lower funnel in the more immediate return space. And that's been big for us. I don't know if it's the same for you.
I'm a lower funnel guy. I'm sorry.
That's
like
my bread and butter too, but it all works
I think
together.
a lot of us are as retail media. Like when you do retail media, it's very you're at the product level. You're at the SKU by SKU detail level, right? I think a lot of us is like, what would you need to elevate that?
I mean,
and have a higher level?
I think for us, like honestly, when I look at like what are my KPIs, like we have a brand marketing team and their focus on brand awareness and brand preference, which is great. And my team kind of comes in a little bit lower down in the funnel, and so I'm focused on ROAS, I'm focused on CPA, I'm focused on unit share. And so with those being my core focus, like we're, I think, increasingly moving again to like some of these partners where we feel like it's a relatively closed ecosystem. And obviously let's talk about Amazon. In my mind, like the beauty of an Amazon is like I really do kind of, at least within the Amazon marketing ecosystem, I do have that end-to-end view of the customer and what they're seeing. And that's what I like. I think when you go and you start looking at like third-party cookies and the degradation there, like going ahead and targeting somebody with, you know, just kind of traditional programmatic kind of, there's cookie degradation. Like the customer that I intended to serve at the very beginning, in many cases is not the customer that I'm ultimately serving. And so that's really challenging. What I love about Amazon is, you know, instead of having to focus as much on view through, I can actually see they saw the display ad, they searched on Amazon, they clicked through, they bought. And for the most part, a lot of our products, if you look at the actual time horizon somebody's purchasing, again, going back to that earlier example, when you're in market for something, when you're in market for a printer, it's because your existing printer, oh, like we printed photos and the colors aren't as good anymore, and so it's not a car, right? You're not researching for months and months on end. You're noticing that your laptop battery isn't lasting as long as it used to. So these conversion windows are generally pretty tight. It's within a couple weeks, and so you know, the ability to kind of see really the full funnel. You know, particularly again within Amazon, because that's increasingly where the activity is happening, for us is extremely consequential. And so I think we're just kind of shifting a lot more of our focus into partners where we actually have that full view from end to end. And you know, and we still, don't get me wrong, like we're still working with Criteo, you know, through Hook Logic to buy on Best Buy. Like we're still doing a lot of that. Like that's definitely critical to our business. But in reality, you know, we're increasingly, I mean, look at CPCs are going up kind of across the board, obviously, particularly in Amazon, but it's getting a lot more expensive, and media budgets aren't necessarily growing concurrently with the increase in costs. And so it's really important that we do have that end-to-end visibility, and we really understand the efficacy of the dollars we're putting into market. And unfortunately, the amount of partners that give us that true end-to-end visibility is increasingly small. And I think over time, it's going to get smaller and smaller. So you're really going to be left with a handful of walled gardens. And you can take this information and extrapolate it and still use it in programmatic widely. But you still do kind of need like a handful of partners to really understand the efficacy of the different media assets that you're putting in market and how effective they are.
Yeah, I think it's a great way to kind of model out some predictions about how some of these newer media worlds will act, right? And it gives you a starting point. But I do think, again, as we have more retail media networks, as we go more up funnel, as we start to try and tie social commerce and, you know, TikTok made me buy it, like all these pieces to the end result of them going on Amazon and purchasing it from there, that's a crap ton more, you know, places to get data. A lot more responsibility in pulling it together to make sense of it, and then even more importance on getting it back to those fragmented different portals, right, for the activation. So it's, I'll use Elizabeth's terminology, it's a shit show, it's fun. No one's figured it out, I don't think, but any parting thoughts that you can provide us in terms of what you need to do to win with data? Make it powerful.
Oh, I have a lot of thoughts. I always have a lot of thoughts.
There is happy hour.
We could talk about this forever, but I think, listen, this is a really exciting and interesting space to be working in, and I'll play a little bit off what you said last, which was I think that there's a lot of really brilliant depth of understanding of data in very specialized verticals, right? You have programmatic folks and retail search people and people working on display who are all masters of their craft and understanding their data signals. And what we need to do now is build breadth, right? So it's like we have that depth, let's build the breadth. Let's find the folks and very intentionally start to look cross-channel, right? Make sure that everything that we're doing is through the business lens, that everyone is marching to the beat of the same drum. I think that's where we unlock our power, right? And I think a lot of kudos to the teams that are working in Group M to do that today. Because historically, maybe we might have just had that really, really good depth, and now it's like, now we're looking across everything, and then the story's really coming together.
Yeah.
We have it in a single place where everyone can access it and make smart decisions. So I think there's never been a better time, and arguably, it's a little bit late to start investing in this as a capability, because it's not going anywhere. It's going to be the foundation of how we make decisions in this wacky ecosystem for many, many years to come.
I think if there were two things to take away, I would say, like, first and foremost, like, more focus on deterministic. I think you really need to kind of move in that direction. If you're still using probabilistic or, modeled audiences, like, great, but like the more deterministic you can be in your targeting, the better. And I think the other piece is really just around like consent. I think customers are increasingly aware of like when they're being targeted, and I think that if they, as a brand, you really want to have full transparency, with your partners and ultimately with the end customer. And so I think understanding the data you're buying, where it's coming from, making sure it was obtained in an above board capacity, I think is absolutely critical. And I think working with platforms that are consent based helps protect you as a brand, helps make sure your customers are getting the right media from you, you're targeting the right people. So again, just focus on consent and focus on deterministic audiences.
Awesome. Thank you guys so very much. We are all ready for lunch. So thank you, everyone.